And thank you to everyone who has signed on. We are thrilled to have Sheryl Winston Smith today giving us an overview of recent research she's been doing, and Chris Tucci is going to be her discussant, which is wonderful. Thank you both so much. The way we will handle the seminar will be Sheryl will present for 25 minutes. If you have clarification questions during that time, please type them in the Q&A and indicate that it's clarification so that I should ask her during her talk. If you have comments or questions that are not clarification, you can certainly type them in the Q&A throughout her talk, but we will get to them after Chris's discussion. So Sheryl will speak for 25 minutes, Chris will discuss for 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And you can type your question in the Q&A during that time or before, or you can put your hand up and I will allow you to unmute yourself so you can ask Sheryl directly. Okay, so the floor is all yours, Sheryl.
Great, so I will share my screen with everyone. Great, so first of all, thank you everyone. Thanks for Liz for inviting me, and thanks everyone who's tuning in virtually. It's really a pleasure to be here, and looking forward to sharing some of my recent work on corporate accelerators and corporate venture capital, and trying to look at the relationship between these two distinct types of knowledge search by established companies. And so when I'm thinking about this, I think one of the sort of motivating factors is just thinking about the imperative for innovation that companies face, that established innovative companies are in the sort of challenge of finding new ideas continuously. And so this is a partner at Draper Fisher, so one of the big venture capital firms, and he says, if I was a senior executive at a large company, my first worry would be that it's a precarious place. Just about every large company should wonder how long it's going to last, and that should be measured in decades at most. The reason is that the pace of change in technology is ever accelerating and subsumes almost every industry over time. And you can see this wreckage in various sectors and think, oh, that won't happen in my sector because I have all kinds of who knows what, unfair competitive advantage, monopoly positions, or hey, I'm the only game in town. And this is all going to change. It will be the new entrants that lead the change. And so that's one thing to think about. And then thinking about it, sort of the counterpart to that is thinking about, well, why is it that companies fail to innovate? And so for this, I always think about, I'm sitting here in Europe, I'm sitting in Oslo, where there's not a lot of baseball going on. In the US, baseball season is just starting in the wake of the coronavirus. And using sort of my favorite baseball quote. And so this is from Babe Ruth, and he's the third highest home run hitter in baseball history. And he says, all I can do is tell them to pick a good one and sock it. I swing big with everything I've got. I swing big and I miss big. But the part of it that I think is most interesting is, as I said, he's the third highest home run hitter in baseball history. But he's hit 714 career home runs, which is, fantastic. I would be very hard hit to ever get even close to that. But he's had 1,330 strikeouts in that same period. In other words, if you do the math on that, he struck out almost twice as many times as he's hit a home run. And I think, to me, that more than anything encapsulates what we're talking about when we're talking about companies trying to get home run breakthrough innovation hits. And this idea that there's this necessity of having to tolerate failure and having to be able to really swing for fences in with the goal of actually getting these home run hits. So if we think about how companies take these, essentially make these swings, how they try to swing for fences and often miss, but sometimes hit these home runs. If we think about the different ways that companies have in their toolbox for innovation, we can think about, corporate venture capital, which, we've studied for a long time, know a lot about. And we can also think about, they certainly have internal innovation efforts, but then also thinking about increasingly the use of corporate accelerators. And so in this particular paper, what I'm really trying to look at is this, sort of within this big picture question of how is it that established companies effectively access outside ideas, particularly when these ideas are coming from startups. And so traditionally, corporate venture capital investment has been one of the primary mechanisms that companies use. And increasingly what we're seeing is corporate accelerators. So the smaller question is really trying to understand to what extent companies might use corporate accelerators, either in addition to or instead of corporate venture capital, to access these outside ideas from startups. And the exploratory question, which is really what I'm focusing on in this paper, is how distinct are the innovation portfolios in corporate accelerators and corporate venture capital portfolios within companies that are engaged in both of these activities. So this is a fairly early research project. So what I'm sharing with you today is some of the early results, and sort of very much looking forward to questions and comments and suggestions moving forward. So here it's really this exploratory research question of really just trying to understand what's happening. What does the phenomenon look like when we look at this comparison between corporate accelerators and CVC? And so the approach that I take in this paper is several propositions and characterizing and comparing corporate accelerators and corporate venture capital along 3 dimensions. In particular, looking at how similar are these the portfolio, so the companies that a given incumbent has within its CVC portfolio or within its corporate accelerator portfolio, how similar are they to one another in terms of the ideas that they're focusing on? And to characterize this, to give a preview, I use machine learning and natural language processing techniques to be able to compare how tightly focused the ideas are within a given portfolio. I also am interested in the diversity of the industry composition. So to what extent is our corporate venture capital or corporate accelerator portfolio companies, are they spanning a greater number and variety of industries relative to one another? And then likewise, the diversity of the geographic composition. So in other words, where physically are these companies coming from in each of these portfolios? So when we're thinking about this as a thought experiment, you can think about how do companies find out early what is a good idea and what might not be a good idea. In other words, how do you identify these home run hits from the strikeouts, and what is the value of learning what doesn't work quickly? And so both corporate venture capital and corporate accelerators, they both operate on a portfolio logic. So that's one of the dimensions, that's very similar and very, and is particularly well suited to this idea of experimentation and learning about what works, what doesn't work. CVC, we expect, that we know that there's a distribution of outcomes. We expect some failures, or CVC investors go into a given investment knowing that there's going to be failures up front. And when you talk to venture capital investors overall, CVC investors in particular, they'll tell you flat out that they know that some of the companies are not going to be successful, but they just can't tell you ex ante which ones those are going to be. Similarly, corporate accelerators, we also have this portfolio logic, a distribution of outcomes, but one of the things that's sort of different here is that it's much more sort of designed around this idea of pivoting, early feedback, and also perhaps encouraging some of the companies to quit more quickly, right? So we can just think about these 2 different types. So this, really briefly, in terms of the literature that this builds on, thinking about this growing literature on search and experimentation and tolerance for failure, right? And so thinking about both in entrepreneurship and in corporate innovation, that a lot of what we find is that companies really need to be able to tolerate failure, that they need to engage in experimentation in order to hit these successes. We also know that contracting for innovation is difficult, and that oftentimes companies are able to mitigate some of the principal agent conflicts through equity alliances, such as venture capital, and also corporate accelerators, where they are frequently taking equity investments. Corporate venture capital, we know, works best when there's strategic overlap, when there's synergies. We know that there's a lot of aspects of both exploration and learning, knowledge acquisition, and similarly for corporate accelerators, thinking about it as part of a landscape of an outside-in approach to innovation, and sort of increasingly being able to think about this balance between the venture and the strategic fit with the corporate innovation. So just so that everyone's on the same page, thinking about corporate accelerators, we're looking at small equity investments with this intensive cohort-based experience for the startup companies. Typically, these are hosted in-house with a corporate accelerator for greater interaction, although some models are a little bit more sort of physically distinct. And then, thinking about a selective application process, usually an equity investment, this explicit design of cohorts that take place over an intense boot camp period, culminating in a demo day experience. So the first proposition here is that both corporate accelerator and corporate venture capital units are going to increase exposure to a variety of ideas that are distinct from, but also complementary to in-house experiment innovation. So, as I was saying earlier, there's a shared portfolio logic for both of these. So this logic of investing in a relatively broad set of earlier stage ideas that are typically much earlier stage than what companies are doing in-house. But we might expect a slightly different emphasis between CA and CVC. So corporate venture capital focusing on a large set of ideas for a relatively small investment, and sort of expecting both innovation and financial returns. And corporate accelerators perhaps targeting innovation solutions with a fit on strategic fit, or with an emphasis on strategic fit, and also oftentimes building an ecosystem. So our first proposition is thinking about corporate accelerator portfolios likely including more tightly focused ideas relative to CVC. The second proposition, sort of related to this first proposition, thinking about industry diversity. And so corporate accelerators increasingly are focusing on industry verticals. Part of the logic that companies have stated for setting up these corporate accelerators is to be able to detect industry disruptions or early warning system, and also oftentimes with a goal of building an industry-wide ecosystem. So our second proposition is that that corporate accelerator portfolios should include fewer industry segments relative to CVC. In other words, a more tightly focused set of industries and corporate accelerators. And then the final proposition here is that geographic diversity. So accelerators draw on startups, accelerators overall, both corporate and standalone traditional accelerators, draw on startups from a greater geographic distribution than venture capital portfolios, because they're cohort-based and have this location-based approach. And having startups in-house for a concentrated period of times, corporate accelerators perhaps reduce some of the monitoring need that lead to the well-known geographic constraints in venture capital and corporate venture capital investing. So the final proposition is corporate accelerators will invest in ventures from a greater variety, so a more diverse set of geographic locations relative to a CVC portfolio. So our sample here focus on companies. So the sample is companies that have both corporate accelerator and corporate venture capital activity. So some companies have only CVC, some have only corporate accelerator. In this, for this research, I'm really interested in companies that are engaging in both of these forms of innovation, both CVC and CA. And so we're looking at companies also that are focused on external ideas from startups, in contrast to some corporate accelerators might be focused more on incubating or scaling internal ideas. In this paper, really focused on these external ideas coming from CVC and CA investment. So the sample, this preliminary sample, is 4 corporates spanning 2 different industries over a 10-year period from 2009 to 2019. And so 2 of the companies, Barclays and Wells Fargo, operate in financial services, and then 2 of the companies, Amazon and Microsoft, operate in internet-related industries. So it's a total of 295 CVC investments and 678 corporate accelerator investments. The data is at the investment startup level dyad. So we have round level data, stage, investors, date, location, industry and sub-industry, as well as, and this is important, detailed description of each of the portfolio companies, what they're doing, their ideas, what they're focused on. The primary data source here is CB Insights, supplemented with Hunch-based and Venture Expert and additional web search. And the portfolio measures that we use in terms of the similarity of the portfolios, I use a natural language processing, so type of machine learning, to identify and characterize the focus of these startups and how they're how tightly related they are to one another. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. And the industry count, so the data I have includes industries that these companies are in. So it's a count of the number of industries, and then likewise a count of the geographic concentration. So the sample itself, just to summarize very briefly, so we have the financial services, we have Barclays and Wells Fargo, and then internet, and both of these have both, as you'll see, both the corporate venture capital investment and corporate accelerators, and then internet and related industries, Microsoft and Alexa. For across all of the companies, you'll see that there's many more deals made in the accelerators relative to CVC, but the total amount invested by CVC versus corporate accelerators, much greater investment overall, right? So fewer deals for, but much more investment in CVC relative to CA. So the methodology in terms of the similarity of the portfolio companies, this is really getting at part of, I think, sort of what's most novel here is thinking about, well, how closely related to each other are the companies that are within a given portfolio. So we use a natural language processing approach where the corporate, using the text descriptions of the portfolio companies, and I'm able to algorithmically compare text descriptions of companies to each other within a given CA or CVC portfolio. And I'm happy to say more about this later in Q&A, but basically the idea is assigning similarity scores across a given portfolio. What we find when we do this for the similarity within portfolios, we find that a given corporate accelerator portfolio has a tighter distribution relative to CVC portfolios. And we see similar patterns both for across the different industries and the different companies. And so really briefly, I think it's easiest to portray this graphically. So across the top line, these are all of the top row here is all of the corporate accelerators. The bottom row are all of the corporate venture capital investments, and each one is stacked for a given company. So if we look in the far left, we're seeing the Barclays Accelerator on the top, and then underneath it, the Barclays CVC portfolio. Likewise, next to it, the Wells Fargo Accelerator, and underneath it, the Wells Fargo CVC portfolio, and likewise for Microsoft Accelerator and CVC, and then Amazon, finally on the far right, Amazon Accelerator and Amazon CVC. But when we look at it, what we see is that the corporate accelerator portfolios overall, it's a more tightly centered distribution of descriptions, and these are, and I mentioned that what we're plotting here, these are essentially the similarity, the cosine similarity, or that textual similarity across these different portfolios. And then when we do tests on the means and variance of these, it's what we see visually, that indeed that the corporate accelerators are more tightly focused. And then this is, I guess, just going into that, as I was saying, in terms of the distribution of these two types, the corporate accelerators versus the corporate venture capital. For the second set of, the second proposition, that corporate accelerator portfolios we find are more tightly clustered by industry than the counterpart CVC portfolios. And we find this again within a given company, and similar patterns for the different industries and the different companies. And in case you can't read this, I will tell you that across the bottom axis for each of these are each one of these tiny print words is a different industry. And again, what we see is that the corporate accelerators are basically more spanning a smaller set of industries or a smaller number of industries, and also, you know, sort of less concentrated relative to the CVC, the comparable CVC portfolio for each of those companies. And again, it's the corporate accelerator on the top row, and then the bottom row is each company's counterpart CVC portfolio. The final proposition that we test is looking at the geographic diversity. And so we find that corporate accelerator portfolios are more geographically diverse than their CVC portfolios. And this is, again, within you know, this given company and across industries and companies. And I point out that this is sort of the opposite of the other propositions, right? So the corporate accelerators are drawing on a more tightly focused set of ideas, a more tightly focused set of industries, but they do have broader geographic reach. And so here, just sort of summarizing in terms of their span within, you know, US, Europe, and Asia. So sort of a fairly broad level, but finding that the corporate accelerators are indeed drawing from a much more diverse geographic set of companies than the CVC. So part of you know, where I'd like to go with this additionally is thinking about both the further study in terms of the stage and the deal flow. And so based on based on both the logic of the corporate accelerators and also from interviews I've been doing, corporate accelerators can be expected to perhaps invest in earlier stage deals than CVC units. And then related to that, this idea that corporate accelerators perhaps serve to facilitate deal flow for corporate venture capital investors. So that corporate accelerators might invest before CVC investors in a given portfolio company. So that's something that I'm you know, working on characterizing for another set of propositions. And then also thinking about whether corporate accelerators might be either substitutes or complements relative to corporate venture capital. And so on the one hand, we might expect that corporate venture capital investments might increase in companies that are coming through a given incumbent's corporate accelerator relative to non-accelerated companies. In other words, you know, we might see these as complements. On the other hand, we can think about these as two different types of swinging for fences, two different types of innovation efforts, and they might be expected to be substitutes, whereas CVC investments will decrease following establishment of a corporate accelerator program. And in a sense, this is sort of a natural horse race, because both of these, you know, both theoretically and sort of, you know, from logically could be expected to come from either of these, or it could be expected to have either of these relationships. I will note that I've been supervising several master's theses on this, you know, related to this particular proposition. And one of the interesting findings that we're starting to see is that having adding a corporate accelerator program to when a company already has a CVC program does seem to increase the innovation outcomes overall. So it increases patenting in these companies. And so this is some preliminary work, but sort of suggestive of sort of this, what might, you know, looking like increasing like perhaps a complementary relationship. So in terms of what comes next, really trying to think about, you know, characterizing the stage of these investments and their relationship to one another, thinking about this deal flow argument, and really trying to understand a little bit more under the hood of this complements versus substitutes and what might be happening. I think I'm just about within the 25 minutes. So at this point, I think I'd love to hear you know, any questions and comments, and I'm really very much looking forward to Chris's discussion. And then I guess Robin or Liz, do you take over now? Or
sorry,
should I stop? Oh, sure. Do
if you can unshare your screen, and then we will have Chris's discussion. So for all the questions can be addressed afterwards. Thank you so much to everyone who's asking questions in the Q&A. And Chris, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think, let me know if you have any problem with the video or the sound here. Thanks a lot for this opportunity, Liz, for the invitation, and Sheryl for writing this paper, which I found very interesting. So I'm just going to make some comments here, maybe try and give you some suggestions for further thought and for further work. So first of all, let me just say what I liked about this paper, because I think it was a very interesting paper. I think it's a great topic. So corporate accelerators versus a corporate venture capital investment. I think it's a new phenomenon. So, you know, the role of, I mean, I think people have done a fair amount of work already on independent accelerators within the last 5 years or so. But the role of corporate accelerators, I think, you know, needs to be better thought out and positioned within the innovation portfolio of big companies. So I think this is a really, really nice start here. So it's as I say here, it's a preliminary exploration. So it's kind of beginning to understand the purposes of a corporate accelerator. And I think it's an interesting method to identify similarities between the companies, you know, at the portfolio level. So using natural language processing to identify the portfolio level similarities. So that's really nice. Now let me talk a little bit about some of my reactions to the paper. And my biggest suggestion right now would be, I think you should at least consider moving away from search as the overall unifying idea here. And I know that probably sounds heretical or something, but I'll tell you why. It's because you have set up this thing from the very beginning on corporate venture capital sort of versus corporate accelerators and the role that they play in knowledge search somehow. And from my own personal experience, typically you end up having to spend a lot of time justifying and defending. Why did you pick corporate venture capital? Why is that? There's lots of, if you think about open innovation, you know, there's alliances, acquisition, you know, internal corporate ventures. You know, why do I care about this one thing versus all these other things that are out there? You know, and I also say CVC is very cyclical. So, you know, I mean, at one point, I think I made the comment that it was a while ago. There were more people studying CVC than there were actual, you know, companies that have been investing in CVC. So to try and get around this issue, because I don't really think you want to go through a very huge, you know, portfolio approach like Vareska van der Vrande did, you know, and I actually will, you know, bring her back in later. But you know, here's another tool in the toolkit for you, and compare it to all these other ones. So one idea I had, but maybe you have other ones, or maybe the audience here has other ones. Maybe this is more about making big companies more entrepreneurial per se. Okay, I think this could be an interesting twist, and it might help motivate the choice of CVC, because if you think about it, all these other ones, alliances, internal corporate ventures, you know, et cetera, you know, you don't really get that kind of access to the company. And, you know, I'm quoting this this case study by Yves Doz, where he talked about Alza and Ciba-Geigy, and they said for sure, you know, Ciba-Geigy, the big company, which eventually became Novartis, said up front, we want to become more entrepreneurial. We want to understand how they think, you know? And so it might be a way, it might be a way of saying, okay, well, CVC is the natural choice there. Since you make an investment, you get a board seat, you go in, and you're talking to them a lot more than you would in other situations. So you might be able to absorb some elements of how they think or how they come up with new ideas. So that's one idea. One definitional question I had was that you mentioned that accelerators sometimes take an equity stake. I don't know about these companies, but in some sense, that would almost be a subset of CVC. I mean, that's the definition of CVC. So, you know, maybe these are smaller ones or something. I mean, I think it's partly the equity stake, but it's partly more of the process, the way that they're, you know, got together in a cohort, et cetera, that makes a corporate accelerator different, but I think you should definitely address that issue just to get it out of the way. Okay, so now I'm just throwing some quotes here, you know, like they engage in external search. So again, I think this is stretching. It's going to be hard to justify CVC versus all the other things. You know, like it's cheaper, you know, you could say it's cheaper. Well, CVC isn't necessarily cheaper. In fact, you found this out later on in the paper. You mentioned this. Actually, they spend a lot more than they spend on accelerators. So I think that you can't make the argument about cheapness per se as a low-cost experimentation tool. I think there's got to be something else to it. And then from the entrepreneur side, it's kind of, I think it's more like a footnote, like whether this is, you know, whether entrepreneurs like this or what do they like about it or not. I think your paper is focused more on the corporate side, which I think is totally fine. But so I wouldn't necessarily muddy the water so much with thinking about the entrepreneurs, except maybe to explain why it's attractive to entrepreneurs as well. You know, it's kind of a footnote or something. Okay, let's talk about the theory development now. You know, I had this hunch that startups approach corporations. You know, like if I have a corporate accelerator, and from my own experience, just talking with startup companies, when there is a company, a big company in town that has an accelerator, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to try and go there and get into their accelerator program. You know, so it's kind of like I'm saying a magnet, whereas a CVC requires the vision of the corporate venture capital team. I'll talk about that in a minute. To scan and scout for new ideas. So in other words, the breadth that these CVCs undertake is based entirely on the CVC's, you know, strategy, whereas the corporate accelerators may be more like an attractor for companies. So, you know, one argument that you could make is the accelerator companies self-censor, right? I'm only going to apply to this particular accelerator because I feel like, oh, I might be like fit very well with their business model, or, you know, they might be a good customer or something like this. Or, you know, you might have the opposite case. Maybe the CVC unit might be too narrowly focused because of, you know, they're just only blinders, you know, they only have blinders for their own thing. So I think it's an empirical question, which sets you right quite well for this phenomenological study. Geography, I think we can quibble about what would be the case, you know, in terms of where you'd want to, which aspect would be, again, more broad-based, geographically speaking. And then just a little minor nit here, which is the propositions. You know, usually we think about propositions as coming at the end of the paper when you're talking about theoretical implications, and you kind of set them up as kind of halfway house to hypothesis or something that you're kind of testing. So depending on the journal, you know, you could just abandon this idea completely, and then you could say, I'm going to just lay out the arguments on both sides, walk through a narrative, and do it something like Academy of Management Discoveries, or maybe you could try and hone in on the most logical, the most empirically supported side, make hypotheses, and just, you know, send it to something like Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. Okay, sample quickly. You know, are these the only 4 companies that had this? It seems. I can't believe it. You know, I think these 4 companies, might be much more open to geographic diversity than most corporate accelerators. I mean, the ones I'm more familiar with, let's just say, they tend to be like local things. The local businesses go and set up shop there, you know? On the other hand, you know, they might be bigger, so these big companies might have their own CVC unit and might search more broadly. Okay, and I had a quick empirical question, which is CVC could mean they made any investment, or it could mean that they created a unit that makes investments on a regular basis. And I think that needs to be clarified here. You know, how you treated your sample and how you picked these. And I think you could make this into a case study. Well, basically, just tell us what they thought. What was the mission of these things? Did they say, we want to attract companies from all over the world, we want to buy them? You know, you know, go through these 4 companies. You have a case and say, you know, I picked these, and here's what they said they wanted to do in their corporate accelerator versus their corporate venture capital. Okay, and then this little minor point here, which is maybe COVID-19's interesting shock. I mean, we may as well get something beneficial from this thing. You know, that the corporate venture capital doesn't involve face-to-face time, but the corporate accelerators do, since they tend to be cohort, they tend to be, you know, together. Maybe there's something there that they had to stop all of a sudden. So that could be interesting for you eventually. Okay, IPOs and exits, I think, are irrelevant to the company. That's just a quick point there, because the company's interested more either in being more entrepreneurial or coming up with more innovations. the results seem consistent to me with the entrepreneurs self-selecting into the corporate accelerators as opposed to corporate venture capital, which might be more outward looking. And I think geography is interesting, but I'm not buying the cross country. I mean, I think cross country is interesting, you know, but geographic diversity is a lot more than that particular, you know, measure. So I think think through a little bit about what kinds of geographic. I'm thinking you might be in the local city versus, you know, further away or something like this. You know, could be interesting. Okay, then I'm just basically coming back to the search story. So I like this idea. I mean, search as a magnet. This is my thing. I mean, I'm just thinking about this now. You know, do whatever you want, but I think here's an idea. Search as a magnet versus search as a deliberate process. And the magnet might be the accelerator and the CVC might be the deliberate process. And then complements versus substitutes. I would only bring that in the discussion. Like, oh, let me speculate a little bit about complements versus substitutes and don't even talk about it at the beginning. And think about Vareska van der Vrande. She actually did some work on these sort of portfolios of open innovation portfolios. And then another interesting question from an empirical, you know, exploration point of view is how have CVC portfolios changed since the development of a diffusion of corporate accelerators? And I would send it, I mean, personally, I think this could be like a discovery in brief. You could send it to Academy of Management Discoveries, but you might have other outlets in mind. So good luck with this interesting work. That's about it. I hope this stimulates some comments and other discussion from the audience. And, you know, congratulations on getting this draft. And I look forward to seeing it in print sometime.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was excellent. Sheryl, I wonder if there's anything you want to respond to Chris on before we get to Q&A. You're on mute.
First of all, let me unmute myself. Chris, thank you. That was fantastic. I really appreciate your insights. And I really love the idea of framing it as entrepreneurial culture rather than a straight out search story. So that's very helpful. And I also think in terms of this idea of search as a magnet versus search as deliberate, I think that's really cool. I have to play around with that in my mind. So I like that analogy a lot. In terms of the sample, and I think some of the Q&A might address this also, but just really briefly, you know, sort of just as a clarification, these are companies that have corporate venture capital units. So that was one of the things you asked, and I should make that more clear, but it's only companies that have an official CVC unit and are making CVC investments through that CVC unit. And then in terms of why these 4 companies, this was actually sort of a preliminary sample. So I'm in the process of collecting data on a much larger, more comprehensive set of companies. So this was a kind of a quick and dirty, in a sense, a sample where it was 4 companies that have long-standing CVC programs as well as long-standing corporate accelerator programs. And then in terms of the geographic diversity, that's actually something I've been sort of thinking about as maybe sort of a different paper. So that's kind of interesting too, that I think that resonates a little bit more on the sort of international business side of things. So, but overall, I think this was great, and maybe I can touch base with you a little bit more offline, but thank you. Super helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to turn to Asim, who has a series of questions. Asim, I'm going to allow you to speak as usual, and you can ask them yourself, if that's okay.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sheryl, really enjoyed that. I think it's fascinating to be looking at the sort of 2 things together. So let me, I'm not going to necessarily ask all my questions because I want other people to have so the 2 things I will say, and you can take these as questions, but you can take them as comments, right? So first, you know, the accelerator, I mean, the similarity in the accelerator, I was curious about whether you're thinking about this as selection or you're thinking about this as treatment, right? So depending on when you're measuring these descriptions, it could be that the accelerator in its process of accelerating has kind of created more similarity in the portfolio of firms that it's working in versus, I mean, the story you told was much more a selection story, right? So we looked for things that seemed more similar, but so, I mean, I don't know if you can look at sort of, you know, using some kind of Wayback Machine or something, depending on what text you're using, of the natural language processing on whether you can look at what they started with as a description versus, you know, where have they ended up as a description. Because I think that, I mean, with the CVC, this is not so much an issue because you're just investing in something and it's not, I mean, you know, yes, you may have some, you obviously have some impact, but it's not clear to me that you're necessarily driving similarity. But being part of an accelerator might create similarity when you didn't start off with similarity, right? And so, you know, I would think about that. And then the other question, you know, I think this builds off actually something that Chris was saying, and Chris, good to see you and thanks for the comments as well. You know, I think on the sample selection side, right, you know, I would have been, I mean, you're sort of picking the ones that do both CVC and accelerators. But it would be interesting to me to see how, even in sort of the cross section, how those are different from the ones that do only CVC, right? So, because I mean, one way of comparing this is to look at their CVC portfolios before and after, but maybe their CVC they're doing a corporate accelerator because their CVC portfolios are too narrow or something like that. And then, you know, so I would be interested to see how does this, is there selection of firms with different CVC portfolios into doing accelerators? And I mean, you know, I know you have other data on CVC anyway, so you might be able to get at that relatively quickly without collecting too much.
So I think those are both really interesting points. And so in terms of the selection or treatment, I think it's, for the most part, the descriptions are, as far as I know, the descriptions are where they start, not where they end up. But I think your idea of the Wayback Machine is intriguing to see if they've actually pivoted, you know, sort of before they enter the accelerator. So I think that's a novel thought that I hadn't really been thinking about it that way, but definitely a good point. And then in terms of the you know, comparing across the cross section, I think that would be very interesting. So, and I do have some of that data already. So, thank you. Both very good suggestion.
Asim, did you want to also ask your question about geography focus and how Amazon might be an outlier in that regard?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's so much about Amazon. I think, you know, I was thinking about, I mean, right now you're just, and I couldn't tell from the graphs were too small for me to read them on my screen. But you know, like there's a version of saying they're more focused, and then there's a version of saying they're more focused around where they are right now, right? Those are not quite the same things, right? So I would be curious to know whether when you say they're more focused, are they focused around their existing geographies or around their more on their existing industry, right? So is it the case that all of these accelerators are focused on, I mean, you're showing us they're focused on a few industries or a few business models, but are they really focused on the things that the firm, the parent firm is doing versus, right? You could focus on something, like you could be Wells Fargo and focus a whole lot on a different area or a different business model, right? That's very different from focusing on a business model or an industry or a geography where you're already present, right? And so, I mean, as a sort of corporate strategy diversification person, I'm saying, okay, but what is, right? And I mean, I think you already, I mean, you have that already. I'm just, you know, I would be curious to know what that looks like. And the reason, the distinction between Amazon is just that obviously Amazon is kind of much broader in its business scope and industry scope potentially than, depending on how you think of Amazon's industry, than many, I mean, Wells Fargo is a much narrower, or Barclays is a much narrower animal than Amazon, right? So, but I don't think it's about Amazon versus others. I just think it's about where is the focus.
So yeah, and I think that's also good points to bring up and thinking. I think the corporate diversification idea is definitely interesting also to think about.
Okay.
And I think, you know, oh, no, go on. I think there's a lot more questions. No, I was just going to say really quickly, and I think this relates to Asim's question, but also to Chris's point. you know, for these accelerators at least, it's very much a global search, and I know, you know, and that they're looking for companies. I think there's definitely an element of companies approaching the corporates, but what I see is that also happens with CVC units. So I think, you know, there's elements of both. I think, you know, I think it's interesting to try to tease that out, and I think that's also kind of on Asim's point, you know, whether it's the corporate is trying to diversify what they're doing versus sort of keeping it more tightly aligned to what they're already working on. So thank you.
Okay, awesome. I'm now going to invite Kiara to ask. She had two questions, one about the algorithm and one about geography. So Kiara, if you can.
So hi everyone, and hi Sheryl. Thanks for this very, very interesting paper. I'm very excited about the technique, but also the topic that you're covering. So one is more of a comment and one is a proper question. So I'll start with the comment. I think the geography aspect, I think there is so much that you could say about it. And in the comment section, I also linked a recent paper by Jorge Guzman, who's looking precisely at companies that move to Silicon Valley to acquire startups, right? So what you're doing kind of reminded me of that, because obviously there is selection also in the firms that choose to take part to CVC or corporate accelerators. And so I'm wondering whether, you know, I was thinking, what would I predict based on like theory, logic, my own experience? I think it's very interesting because I don't have a clear answer to that. I mean, what I've seen by working with accelerators is that a lot of companies are actually willing to move to actually access the accelerator, but then these might be the best companies that are in resource poor areas that are willing to move. So I'm wondering whether overall you have any way to either look at that and or to quantify the benefits of moving for these kind of firms. I think that could be very interesting. And then the proper question that I have, and I'd love to have an answer from you, is whether you can say a bit more about the algorithm that you use. I see it's cosine similarity. So I'm wondering, I know a little bit about text analysis. So I'm wondering, what are the trade-offs associated with that technique? And have you thought about alternatives, such as looking at topic modeling and overlapping topics? And if so, what would be the benefits of using this technique? Thank you.
Sure. So thank you. So on the comment, yeah, I think that those are great comments, and I'd love to talk to you more about some of that on the geography, and I'll take a look at Jorge's paper. On the algorithm, really briefly, I would say that I've thought about, you know, using this. It's a natural language processing algorithm. So the advantages of this are being able to basically create a comparison between, you know, basically between two different bodies of text. And so in this case, it's the bodies of text within each of the companies, and being able to compare them to each other and see how tightly related they are. Topic modeling, I've thought about, and also just briefly to do the algorithm, and I'm happy to share more of this. And I've written up in some other work, but I'm happy to share much more on this. But I do it mostly using Python, and there's a lot of ways that you can do it and sort of build it out. So I've built most of it out myself. So it's very flexible. And as I said, I'm happy to share more sort of offline on sort of how I do that. In terms of topic modeling, that's also something I've been intrigued by. I think it has there's different advantages and disadvantages to each. So I think in terms of trying to maybe pull out some of this idea of the corporate diversification, as Asim was mentioning, I think something like topic modeling might be really nice in that. And I could certainly envision, comparing to some of the company's own statements. That's something, within this paper, I've been focused on comparing within the portfolio. I haven't really looked relative to the other, to the corporate parent itself. And I think, I can think of some intriguing ways to do that. And then I think, what was the other? I missed the last, and I think you had mentioned another approach, but I think I missed what that was.
No, I was just referring to topic modeling. So.
Oh, okay, to topic modeling in particular. But yeah, no, I'd be happy to talk more offline. So definitely.
Awesome. Cool. That's
Thank you.
great question, and very cool, Sheryl, that you were building these models out yourself. Okay, Jenny Kwan has a great comment, and I'm wondering if she can expand on it. Jenny, I'm going to allow you to talk, if that's okay.
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, I just, it was just a small comment. I think I just thought it was a cool idea that, you know, kind of Chris looking at how accelerators can be a magnet. They just have a different presence in the sort of startup community. They are kind of like more open, kind of open for business. People can apply. And that's really not the way, you know, venture capital works, including corporate venture capital, where it's all through, you know, invisible networks and things like that. So I think just thinking about that as an organizational form issue for different business models is kind of, I thought, what, you know, kind of Chris was getting at. Super interesting. Thank you.
That's much more insightful than how I put it.
I like how both of you put it. So, and I think that's a good point in terms of like the sort of explicit, fairly reasonably transparent application process versus a lot of what goes on more behind the scenes in CVC. But that's a very good point.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And it looks like we have one last question from Judy Hahn. I'm going to allow you to talk and ask your question yourself, if that's okay.
Hi, I think my question is aligned with what Chris said and what Jenny said. So the corporate accelerators, I think startups are more applying for that program, while CVC is like searching for the specific startups that they want to invest in. So these two different processes may make your study more interesting, looking at these differences. So like, have you ever thought about this more processing-wise, that like what corporate accelerators, startups apply for it, CVC actually seek for these startups? So
yeah, so I think I haven't been looking at that in this paper, but I think that's a really good good insight in your comment, and also, you know, from Chris's comment, and just thinking about the search process that CVC units engage in and the search process that corporate accelerators engage in. I will say, you know, just sort of from interviews I've done with CVC managers and corporate accelerator managers, I think to a large extent, it's a somewhat similar search process, in that, at least in the ones I've been interviewing, they're looking broadly, you know, and sort of looking to tap into ideas and to tap into startups, you know, that relate to what they're interested in, broadly defined. And I think they're both the CA and CVC managers are definitely engaged in a search process. At least what I'm seeing with the corporate accelerators is it's definitely a search. I think, to Jenny's point, there's more of an open for business approach, where there's an open call for applications, and then you know, so they'll get, you know, many hundreds or 1,000 applications for 10 spots, for example. So then there's the internal process of evaluating and scoring and, you know, determining which companies are ultimately offered a spot. And so I think, to the extent that it's more transparent, I think that's very, very interesting, because it's that's where I think this magnet idea can come in, of you know, different startups identifying. At the same time, you know, certainly as startups and CVC investors are also, you know, getting pitched by startups, and also getting sort of feeds from other VCs that they invest with, and from others in the industry. But I think it would be very interesting to be able to try to tease out this magnet effect of, you know, startups coming directly to the corporate versus a little bit more of a sort of directed search. So I think I like that point, Judy, and you know, I think, you know, and to, you know, as I said, I haven't been looking at it, although I think that does come out in some of the interviews, and it's definitely something worth exploring more explicitly. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you both. So I left Asim had a follow-up comment on Jenny's point that I left open for you, Sheryl, just so you can see it. And I left Kiara's comment so you can see the link to Jorge's paper.
Oh, okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Sheryl, so much, and Chris, and all the participants. This was a great, lively discussion, lots to think about, and super interesting, novel topic too. So we're really grateful for that.